What happens when one of the greatest actors in the history of cinema, a man who has spent 6 decades defining what it means to be a serious artist, who has created characters so indelible they have become part of the American consciousness, sits down on a late-night talk show expecting a professional conversation, only to find himself ambushed by a host who seems more interested in scoring political points than discussing craft? What you're about to witness is one of the most explosive confrontations ever captured on late-night television. The moment when Robert De Niro, the legendary Oscar winner who brought Travis Bickle and Jake LaMotta and Jimmy Conway to life, reminded the world that the quiet intensity he brings to his roles isn't just acting. The studio went dead silent, the laughter stopped completely, and Jimmy Kimmel discovered that some legends don't appreciate being treated like fodder for viral clips. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to subscribe and drop your thoughts in the comments, because trust me, you're going to want to talk about this one. The evening had started with the usual energy at the El Capitan Theater in Hollywood, where Jimmy Kimmel Live had been taping for over 2 decades. Robert De Niro was coming on the show to promote his latest film, and there was a palpable sense of anticipation among the staff. De Niro was notoriously private, rarely doing talk show appearances, and when he did, he was famously economical with words. Getting him to open up was considered something of a challenge, and Jimmy had reportedly been preparing for days. De Niro arrived at the studio with the quiet intensity that had defined his entire career. At 81 years old, he moved more slowly than the young method actor who had transformed himself into Jake LaMotta, but his eyes still carried that famous watchfulness, that sense that he was observing everything and revealing nothing. He was there to discuss his new project, a film that had taken years to complete and represented some of his most personal work. What nobody anticipated was that Jimmy had arrived at the studio that evening with a very different agenda. The house band played De Niro onto the stage, and the audience applause was thunderous, the kind of reception reserved for true legends of the industry. De Niro walked out with his characteristic understated presence, shaking Jimmy's hand with a firm grip before settling into the guest chair. His expression was neutral, watchful, giving nothing away. "Robert De Niro, everybody," Jimmy announced, his trademark grin firmly in place. "It's an honor to have you here. You don't do a lot of these talk shows." "No, I don't," De Niro replied, his voice carrying that familiar gravelly quality. "But I'm here to talk about the film, so here I am." The brevity of the response was classic De Niro, and the audience chuckled appreciatively. Jimmy nodded, seemingly prepared for the challenge of drawing out one of Hollywood's most famously reticent interview subjects. "So let's talk about the film," Jimmy began, and for a few minutes, the conversation flowed normally. De Niro discussed the project with the quiet passion of a craftsman talking about his work, describing the years of development, the challenges of the production, the collaboration with his director and co-stars. He was engaged, but measured, offering insights without excess, every word chosen with care. Then Jimmy leaned forward, and something in his demeanor shifted. "You know, Bob, I have to ask you about something that's been in the news a lot over the years. Your political comments, the speeches, the awards show moments. You've become almost as famous for your politics as for your acting. Don't you think that's a problem?" The question seemed to catch De Niro slightly off guard. His eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained controlled. "A problem for who?" "Well, for your career, for one thing," Jimmy pressed. "There are a lot of people out there who used to love your movies, but now can't separate the actor from the political figure. You've alienated half your potential audience." De Niro was silent for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried an edge that made several audience members shift in their seats. "I've been making movies for 60 years, Jimmy. I've never made decisions based on what might alienate people. I make the work I want to make. I say what I believe needs to be said. That's how I've always operated." Jimmy nodded, but there was something performative about his understanding. But there's a difference between making artistic choices and using award shows to drop F-bombs about political figures. Don't you think that was a bit much? A bit unprofessional? The reference was clear to everyone in the studio. De Niro's famous profane outburst at the Tony Awards had made headlines around the world and had become a defining moment of his public political stance. "Unprofessional?" De Niro's voice dropped to something quieter, more dangerous. "I've been a professional in this industry for 6 decades. I've shown up on time, known my lines, done the work. I've treated every project with respect and every collaborator with professionalism. One moment of genuine emotion at an awards show doesn't erase 60 years of professionalism. But it's not just one moment, is it? Jimmy pushed harder. It's interview after interview, speech after speech. You've made your political views a central part of your public identity. Some people might say you've become more of a political figure than an actor at this point. Something shifted in De Niro's expression. The careful neutrality gave way to something harder, more intense. Some people might say that. Those people would be wrong. I've made 5 films in the last 3 years. I'm working constantly. The work speaks for itself. What I do outside of that work, what I say as a citizen of this country, that's separate. Is it though? Jimmy's smile had taken on an edge that didn't quite match his usual affable persona. Because a lot of people can't watch Taxi Driver or Goodfellas anymore without thinking about your political rants. You've colored your own legacy. The accusation landed heavily in the quiet studio. De Niro stared at Jimmy for a long moment, and those who had seen his films recognized the look. It was the same quiet intensity that had preceded some of the most memorable moments in cinema history. My legacy, De Niro said slowly, is the work. Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, The Godfather Part 2, The Deer Hunter, Goodfellas, Heat, Casino, The Irishman. That's my legacy. Not speeches, not interviews, the work. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping even lower. And let me tell you something about that legacy, Jimmy. Those films will be watched long after both of us are gone. Long after whatever political moment we're living through has passed into history. The work endures. Everything else is noise. Jimmy seemed momentarily thrown by the intensity of the response, but he recovered quickly. But don't you think actors should maybe stay in their lane? I mean, you're not a political scientist. You're not a policy expert. You're an actor. Why should anyone care what you think about politics? The question was clearly designed to diminish, to put De Niro in his place. But if Jimmy expected the legendary actor to back down, he had fundamentally misread his guest. Why should anyone care what I think? De Niro's laugh was short and humorless. I'm an American citizen. I have the same right to express my views as anyone else. The fact that I'm famous doesn't take away that right. It doesn't make my opinions less valid. He paused, his eyes boring into Jimmy's. And let me ask you something. You sit behind that desk every night and share your political opinions with millions of people. You do entire monologues about politics. You have political figures on as guests. But when I express my views, suddenly actors should stay in their lane? How does that work exactly? The counterattack was precise and devastating. Jimmy's face flushed slightly, but he tried to maintain his composure. That's different. I'm a talk show host. Political commentary is part of what I do. And I'm a citizen who has been given a platform, De Niro shot back. What I do with that platform is my choice. You can disagree with my opinions. You can think I'm wrong about everything. But don't sit there and tell me I don't have the right to speak. Jimmy tried to steer the conversation in another direction. Okay, let's set the politics aside for a moment. Let's talk about your recent work. Because I have to be honest, Bob, some critics have said that your recent films haven't quite lived up to your earlier work. That maybe you've been taking too many paycheck roles. What do you say to that? The shift from politics to a critique of his work seemed designed to keep De Niro off balance. But the legendary actor had been dealing with critics for 60 years. I've made over 100 films in my career. Some are better than others. That's true for any actor who works consistently over decades. But I choose my projects carefully. I work with directors I respect on stories I believe in. If some critic thinks I should have retired 20 years ago, that's their opinion. I'm still here, still working, still pushing myself. But the quality, Jimmy pressed. Some of these recent comedies, the family movies, it's a long way from Taxi Driver. De Niro's expression hardened further. You want to compare movies? Fine, let's compare. In the last 10 years, I've worked with Martin Scorsese on The Irishman. I've done serious dramatic work that challenged me in new ways. I've also done lighter films because sometimes I want to do something different, something that doesn't require me to go to the darkest places. His voice was rising now, carrying an intensity that seemed to fill the entire studio. I'm 81 years old. I've given this industry 60 years of my life. I've sacrificed relationships, health, time with my family to do this work. And you want to sit there and tell me that my recent output doesn't measure up to your standards? Who the hell are you to judge? The outburst seemed to startle everyone in the studio, including Jimmy. The audience had gone completely silent, sensing that this had moved far beyond typical late-night banter. "Bob, I'm not trying to disrespect your career," Jimmy said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I'm just asking questions that a lot of people have." "No, you're not." De Niro's voice had dropped back to that quiet, dangerous register. "You're trying to generate controversy. You're trying to get a clip that will go viral. You invited me here supposedly to talk about my film, but you've spent the entire interview attacking my politics and questioning my legacy. That's not journalism, that's ambush." Jimmy opened his mouth to respond, but De Niro wasn't finished. "I've done hundreds of interviews in my career. I know the difference between a journalist asking hard questions and a host trying to create a moment for his own benefit. This is the second one." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Jimmy's usual quick wit seemed to have deserted him. "Let me tell you something about my career that you apparently don't understand," De Niro continued, his voice carrying the weight of 6 decades of experience. "I came up in a different era, an era when actors were judged by their work, not their Twitter presence. An era when the craft meant something. I studied with Stella Adler. I worked with the greatest directors of multiple generations. I transformed my body, my voice, my entire being for roles because that's what the work demanded." He stood up slowly, and the movement commanded instant attention. Even at 81, there was something formidable about his presence, something that reminded everyone in the room that this was the man who had inhabited some of the most dangerous characters in cinema history. "And now I sit here, being questioned about my choices by someone who makes his living telling jokes about celebrities. Being told I should stay in my lane by someone whose lane is making fun of people like me. Do you see the irony in that, Jimmy? Do you understand how absurd this whole conversation has been?" Jimmy tried to recover. "Bob, please, sit down. Let's talk about the film." "We should have been talking about the film from the beginning." De Niro's voice was cold. "That's why I agreed to come here. Instead, you wanted to relitigate every political statement I've made and suggest that I've somehow squandered my legacy by having opinions." He looked out at the audience, and something in his expression shifted to something almost like sadness. "I want to say something to everyone here and everyone watching at home. I've spent my entire adult life trying to create work that means something, work that reflects the human condition in all its complexity. I've played criminals and saints, fathers and psychopaths, ordinary men and extraordinary ones, and I've tried to bring truth to every single one of those characters." His voice grew stronger. "That's what actors do. We try to illuminate something about what it means to be human. And sometimes, outside of our work, we see things happening in the world that we feel compelled to speak about. That's not abandoning our craft. That's being human beings who care about something beyond ourselves." He turned back to Jimmy, and his gaze was unflinching. "You asked me why anyone should care what I think about politics. Here's my answer. They shouldn't care because I'm famous. They should listen or not listen based on whether what I'm saying makes sense to them. Fame doesn't make me right, but it also doesn't make me wrong, and it certainly doesn't take away my right to speak." Jimmy made one more attempt. "Bob, I respect you enormously. I'm sorry if this interview went in a direction you didn't expect. Can we start over? Talk about the film?" De Niro shook his head slowly. "No, Jimmy, we can't start over, because you've shown me exactly what this was supposed to be. Not a conversation about craft or art or the work I've dedicated my life to. A gotcha session designed to generate headlines. Well, you'll get your headlines, but not the ones you wanted." He straightened his jacket with the same deliberate precision he had brought to 100 film roles. "I've been Travis Bickle and Jake LaMotta and Jimmy Conway. I've stood in front of cameras and bared my soul in ways that most people never have to. I've let audiences see my fear, my rage, my vulnerability, my darkness. That takes courage, real courage." His eyes locked onto Jimmy's. "What you do takes a different kind of courage, I suppose. The courage to sit in a comfortable chair and take shots at people who actually create things. The courage to criticize without ever having to put yourself on the line. That's a special kind of bravery, Jimmy, the kind that never risks anything." The observation was devastating in its quietness. Jimmy sat frozen behind his desk, the usual quick comebacks completely absent. De Niro turned to address the camera directly. To anyone watching who cares about the work, the film opens next month. It's a story about family, about legacy, about what we leave behind. I'm proud of it. I hope you'll see it and judge it on its merits, not on whatever controversy this interview generates. He looked back at Jimmy one final time. I've been doing this for 60 years. I've worked with the greatest artists of multiple generations. I've pushed myself harder than you can imagine to try to create something true. And at the end of the day, that's all that matters. Not the politics, not the interviews, not the opinions of talk show hosts. The work. The work is everything. He paused, and when he continued, his voice carried a weight that seemed to fill the entire studio. You know what I find interesting, Jimmy? You've built a career on being likable, on being the guy everyone feels comfortable with, the safe choice for a late-night host. And there's nothing wrong with that. But somewhere along the way, you decided that being likable meant never challenging yourself, never taking real risks, never putting yourself in a position where you might actually lose something. The observation cut deep, and Jimmy's expression showed it. I've risked everything for my work. I've gained 60 pounds, lost 60 pounds, learned to box professionally, spent months in Sicily learning a dialect, lived in the skin of people who terrified me. That's what commitment to craft looks like. What have you ever committed to that deeply, Jimmy? What have you ever risked? The question hung in the air, unanswered and unanswerable. De Niro nodded once, a gesture that carried a finality that was unmistakable. Thanks for having me on. I won't be back. And with that, Robert De Niro walked off the stage with the same quiet intensity that had made him a legend. The audience sat in stunned silence, unsure whether to applaud or simply process what they had witnessed. The band leader started to play something, then stopped, sensing the moment was too heavy for music. Jimmy Kimmel sat behind his desk, looking like a man who had just realized he had fundamentally miscalculated. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before he finally spoke, his voice lacking all of its usual energy. "We'll be right back." But everyone in that studio knew that what they had just witnessed wasn't something that could be fixed with a commercial break. A legend had been disrespected, and that legend had reminded everyone exactly why he had earned that title. Not through anger or shouting, but through the same quiet, devastating presence that had made him one of the greatest actors who ever lived. The aftermath of that interview would dominate entertainment news for weeks. Clips of De Niro's measured but devastating responses would be shared millions of times. Think pieces would be written about respect, about legacy, about the difference between journalism and provocation. Some would defend Jimmy's right to ask tough questions. Many more would note that there was a difference between tough questions and disrespect, and that De Niro had revealed that difference simply by responding with the dignity of a master. And somewhere in all that noise, the film would open, and audiences would be reminded of why Robert De Niro had mattered for 60 years. Not because of his politics, or his interviews, or his controversies, because of the work. Because when the lights went down and the screen lit up, he could make you believe in people who never existed, and feel things you never expected to feel. That was his legacy, and no late-night interview could ever take that away. But perhaps the most significant outcome was what the confrontation revealed about the current state of celebrity interviews. In an era where everything was content, where every moment was potential fodder for viral clips and social media engagement, De Niro had reminded everyone that some things were still sacred: craft, legacy, the right to be treated with basic respect regardless of whether your opinions were popular. He had walked into that studio as a guest and walked out having taught a lesson about dignity that would resonate far beyond that single evening. For those who had grown up watching Travis Bickle stare into the mirror, watching Jake LaMotta destroy himself in the ring, watching Jimmy Conway survey the wreckage of a life built on violence, there was something deeply satisfying about seeing that same intensity deployed in defense of something real. De Niro hadn't played a character that night. He had simply been himself, a man who had given everything to his art and wasn't about to let anyone diminish that gift. What do you think about this incredible confrontation? Was Jimmy Kimmel right to push De Niro on his political statements, or did he cross a line? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more stories that will absolutely leave you speechless.